Good morning. We'll get started now. Morning, I'm Felicia Marcus, the chair of the board, and today is May 6th at 9:15. We're resuming the meeting we started yesterday. For those of you who weren't here, and that's most of you, although some of you were here yesterday, you hardy few. To my left is Vice Chair Fran Spivey Weber. To her left, Board Member Dee Dee Diadamo. To my right, Board Member Tam Dodak. And to her right, Board Member Stephen Moore. Mr. Howard, can you introduce the staff that's assisting today?
Yes, thank you. To my right, Chief Deputy John Bishop, and to my left, Chief Counsel Michael Laufer, and assisting the board today are Courtney Davis and Janine Townsend. And John, would you like to introduce the staff that will be assisting the board?
Yes, good morning. Making today's presentation will be Claire Wagner from our Ocean Unit. Assisting her will be Marley Wood and Paul Hannon. I can't see the person. Yeah, okay.
Great, thank you very much. Emergency evacuation procedure, look for the exit nearest you. If you hear an emergency sound, gather your belongings and your friends and proceed carefully outside. Our staff will be gathering near J and 10th, and if you want to join us, you'll know when the all clear may come to come back into the building. And then finally, please set your noisemakers on stun or silent or turn them off entirely. And when you come and speak at the microphone, which is obviously there, I just can't see it, when we come to public comment, make sure that you're close enough to it, as you see the difference, close enough to it that it's heard over the PA system so that we know that the folks who are listening on the web can hear you, but not so close that it pops, which you can't tell. So you just have to try and get as close as you can, but not too close. So I think that's it. We just want to make sure everybody can hear you in addition to us. And with that, let's move right along to item number 7.
Good morning.
Right.
So since the drought has persisted in California, regional and local water agencies have been looking into new or underutilized water resources in order to meet water demands. And some coastal communities are exploring the use of seawater desalination to provide reliable water supply options. Now, seawater desalination is not the answer to California's water problems, but communities in need may use it in conjunction with foundational supplies and other new or underutilized water sources, such as improving water conservation, stormwater capture, and water recycling to diversify their water portfolios. But in order for these new and underutilized water resources to be sustainable, they'll have to balance the need to provide water for human health and public safety with environmental protection. Today, the board will consider the adoption of an amendment to the Water Quality Control Plan for ocean waters and the staff report with substitute environmental documentation that provides direction for how to best assess and minimize the environmental effects associated with seawater desalination facilities. In doing so, it'll provide more regulatory certainty for permittees by laying out the requirements for those choosing to pursue seawater desalination. The proposed desalination amendment includes the language to be inserted in Chapter 3M of the Ocean Plan, which is the implementation provisions for desalination facilities. The revisions to Table 2 that address the point of compliance with the Table 2 effluent limitations for facilities that commingle brine, and the conforming changes in Section 10.1 and Appendix 3 that address salinity monitoring from point source discharges and non-substantive changes in the ocean plan, such as fixing capitalization and punctuation issues. So I'd like to take a moment and just thank all of the past and present staff who worked on this project over the years to get it to this point. The project started in 2007 with the first scoping meeting, and the amendment was developed using the best available science, including information from expert panels and scientific studies. The desalination amendment also underwent an external scientific peer review process where 7 subject matter experts reviewed the scientific conclusions in the amendment. And as you can see by the water droplets, there have been numerous opportunities over the years for stakeholders to provide feedback on the desalination amendment. And we've been fortunate to have an actively engaged stakeholder community that's worked to improve the amendment, staff's worked to improve the amendment based on their feedback. So bear with me for the next minute as I explain this last sort of release of the drafts. Since the first release back in July last summer. So the first amendment was released for, the first draft amendment was released for a 45-day public comment period on July 3rd, and we received 30 letters, including 740 comments during that first period, which staff responded to. And we took those comments into consideration and revised a draft which was released to the public on March 20th for a second round of public comments. During that second public comment period, we received and responded to 17 letters and 150 comments. And the revised draft from that round of stakeholder interaction was released on April 24th, 2015. So after April 24th, staff continued to work with stakeholders to resolve remaining issues, and we released Change Sheet 1 on May 1st, 2015. So Change Sheet 1 included the revisions to the definition of existing facilities. It had more detail on economic feasibility. It had changes to reflect the unique situation at Poseidon's Carlsbad desalination facility. It included the prohibition on flow augmentation using surface water intakes for other facilities. It has changes to the definition of natural background salinity, plus several non-substantive changes. So in addition to Change Sheet 1, for the convenience of our stakeholders, we released a May 1st version of the draft amendment, which included all changes in Chapter 3M since March 20th, including the changes in Change Sheet 1. We released a second change sheet on May 4th, which further refined 2 of the changes in Change Sheet 1, economic feasibility and the definition of natural background salinity. On May 5th, we released a final draft version of the amendment that included all of the changes since March 20th to Chapter 3M, including changes in both Change Sheets 1 and 2. This May 5th version is the version that we'll be referring to today. And I'd like to note that we didn't recirculate the entire Ocean Plan Amendment as it would, we didn't include Chapter 3M in the entire Ocean Plan Amendment as it would appear because we were making so many last minute changes that we ran out of time to put the whole package together. But there were no changes made to the other portions of the Ocean Plan since the release of April 24, 2015. So the only revisions since the 24th of April were all reflected in Chapter 3M. And so all drafts, including the change sheets, were publicly noticed through the board's LIRIS and through the Ocean Plan LIRIS. And so it's been a fairly intensive process, but again, thanks to our stakeholders for being engaged throughout this whole process. So I'll briefly summarize the 4 main components of the desalination amendment. The first section describes which facilities would be covered under the amendment. It clarifies the Water Board's authority over intakes versus discharges, and it includes definitions of new, expanded, and existing facilities. The second section of the proposed amendment provides direction to the regional water boards on how to conduct a California Water Code Section 13142.5b determination. And for this determination, the Regional Water Board will determine the best available site, design, technology, and mitigation measures feasible to minimize intake and mortality of all forms of marine life for any new or expanded seawater desalination facility. The second section identifies preferred intake and discharge technologies, which are subsurface intakes when feasible, and commingling and multi-port diffusers for the discharges. But the amendment does allow for future technological innovation. So if an owner or operator can demonstrate that the alternative technology results in comparative intake and mortality of all forms of marine life as the preferred technology, there's flexibility in the amendment to allow for that. The third section includes the narrative receiving water limitation for salinity and also an option to apply for an alternative facility-specific receiving water limitation. The fourth and last section includes monitoring and reporting requirements, and the third and fourth sections of the amendment would apply to any seawater desalination facility discharging into the ocean, and this is because the Water Board's authority for discharges is broader than it is over the intakes. So now I'm going to walk through some of the more significant changes to the draft since the July 3rd release. This is really just a moment to congratulate the board and staff on the adoption of the trash amendment, which bumped the desal amendment from section L to section M. Okay, into the substantive changes. Change sheet 1 includes a revision to strike out the last sentence in the definition of existing facilities. Now remember that Water Code section 13142.5b only applies to new or expanded facilities. It doesn't cover existing facilities. Now we identified 11 coastal facilities that are already constructed and permitted. Facilities 1 through 9 in this table are located in the Central Coast region, and the last 2 are in the Los Angeles region. So with the exception of the City of Santa Barbara's facilities, these are all very small facilities. Most of them are producing, well, all of them with the exception of City of Santa Barbara are producing less than 1 million gallons per day. Some of these only operate intermittently, and some aren't even active at this point in time. Now the previous draft amendment included the last sentence that's in strike-through red text on the slide. The pre-strike-through definition meant that any facility that did not have a Water Code section 13142.5b determination would need an official determination, or else the facility would not be considered existing facility under the desalination amendment. So the initial intention was to go through and issue each of these facilities a determination and capture any facilities that we didn't know about, and then also those that we did. So back in July, when the July 3rd draft was released, the City of Santa Barbara expressed an urgent need to start operating their seawater desalination facility if drought conditions continued. So State Water Board staff and Regional Water Board staff worked with the City of Santa Barbara to prevent potential operational delays. And the Central Coast Regional Water Board issued a Water Code section 13142.5b determination through a permit amendment in January of 2015. So the Central Coast Regional Water Board applied Water Code section 13142.5b retroactively, which meant staff looked at the old record from the original project and the permit approvals that were made at the time and concluded that if section 13142.5b had been applied, based on the understanding of mortality and mitigation at the time the project was approved, that the Regional Water Board would have issued the determination. So as you can imagine, this presented challenges from a permitting perspective, and it seemed to be mutually unsatisfying for staff and the environmental community. So without the revisions on the slide, the Central Coast region would have to go through this process for 8 facilities, and the LA region would have to go through this process for 2 facilities. So this would create substantial burden for the already resource-limited Central Coast Regional Water Board staff. And again, these facilities, the largest is probably only withdrawing just over 1 million gallon a day. And some of these only operate intermittently and some are currently inactive. So by removing the language, the facilities in the table would be considered existing facilities, which would mean they would only need the Water Code section 13142.5b determination if they expanded. However, they would all have to comply with the receiving water limitation for salinity. So staff's proposing to consider the 10 facilities on the previous slide in addition to the City of Santa Barbara that has their Water Code determination, an existing facility by revising the definition in the amendment. The next revision since July 3rd, 2014 is the addition of a definition of feasible. So during our first public comment period, all stakeholders expressed an interest in including a definition for feasible. But there was a debate as to whether to include the CEQA definition that considers cost or to use the once through cooling definition of not feasible that does not consider cost. Staff included the CEQA definition of feasible in the March 20th draft amendment, and this definition of feasible is consistent with the Coastal Act. It's previously been applied in a Water Code section 13142.5b determination for the Carlsbad desalination facility, and the use of the definition was upheld by an appellate court in the case of Surfrider versus the California Regional Water Quality Control Board. So the decision to include this definition was in part because it's more appropriate for facilities that have not yet been built, because there's substantial unknowns associated with new facilities that will be built at some point in the future. So we think it's appropriate to consider cost in this case. So the definition of feasible was included in Appendix 1 definitions of the Ocean Plan, and it would be applied throughout Chapter 3M whenever the issue of feasibility comes up. Since the CEQA definition of cost was included, there have been concerned stakeholders who raised the issue that cost could now be used to automatically reject subsurface intakes or other environmentally preferred options since they may have higher associated costs. So staff included the general definition of feasible, but also provided more detailed factors to consider when whether a subsurface intake is feasible. So these are included in Chapter 3M2D1, which are the intake technology section. And so in Change Sheet 1, staff revised the feasibility factors. We added to the entire facility for the factor that now reads energy use for the entire facility. And we deleted impact on freshwater aquifers, local water supply and existing users, desalinated water conveyance, and existing infrastructure. So these factors were removed for one or more reasons. Some of the factors would only apply in some cases. Others were already captured by other factors, and some were removed because they're not related to the intake and mortality of all forms of marine life. Now, there may be other factors to include in the feasibility of subsurface intakes that are not listed in this section for this analysis, such as greenhouse gas emissions or existing infrastructure. However, the focus of this amendment is on the feasibility as it relates to intake and mortality of marine life. Other types of feasibility factors are not addressed by this amendment, but are certainly within the purview of the CEQA lead agency. So for example, some commenters have asserted that there will be higher greenhouse gas emissions released when withdrawing water from subsurface intakes. But this is the type of impact that would be addressed, again, by the CEQA lead agency and not necessarily in this analysis. Other changes in this section are in the subsection I and double I. So we included language that says, subsurface intakes shall not be determined to be economically infeasible solely because subsurface intakes may be more expensive than surface intakes. Subsurface intakes may be determined to be economically infeasible if the additional costs or lost profitability associated with subsurface intakes as compared to surface intakes would render the desalination facility not economically viable. So this is based on the existing case law interpreting feasibility under CEQA. We're not creating a new definition of feasible, but we had commenters ask for more clarification, so we thought it would be appropriate to be more specific regarding economic feasibility. We also added language in subset double I of 3M2D1A that if a regional water board determines that subsurface intakes are not feasible for the proposed intake design capacity, it shall determine whether subsurface intakes are feasible for a reasonable range of alternative intake design capacities. And this is to help inform the decision where the regional water board may find that a combination of subsurface and surface water intakes is the best feasible technology to minimize intake and mortality of marine life. So it'll help provide them with the information they need to make that decision. We also added in this section and still meet regional need for water as described in Chapter 3M2B2 to make it clear that the Regional Water Board can require subsurface intakes to the extent feasible, but it should defer to the local or regional water agencies' identification of their water needs for the entire project. Okay, switching topics. There were some revisions to Chapter 3M2D2, which is the brine discharge technology section. This section still allows for future technological innovations, but it restricts flow augmentations to only those using subsurface intakes, with one potential exception. In change sheet number 1, the amendment was revised to include a provision that allows a facility that has received a conditional 13142.5B determination and is over 80% constructed to apply for an exception that would allow the use of flow augmentation using surface water intakes if studies were completed that showed that the system provides comparable intake and mortality of all forms of marine life as the preferred brine discharge technologies. So the only facility that meets this description to our knowledge is the Carlsbad Desalination Facility. So the Carlsbad Desalination Facility was issued a conditional 13142.5B determination based on the operating conditions where they're co-located with the Encina power plant and using Encina's effluent as the desalination facility's influent. The conditional approval will be reevaluated once the Encina power plant eventually shuts down. And Poseidon is trying to design the facility for the future. So they believe they can show that a flow augmentation system using surface water intakes will result in a comparable level of intake and mortality of all forms of marine life as the preferred brine discharge technologies identified in the amendment. However, since flow augmentation using surface water intakes is not a conventional technology or method to dilute brine, the system has not yet been well studied. So at this point in time, we're not aware of others proposing to use the system, and due to the lack of data, we're not yet convinced that this is an appropriate approach to use for any other future new or expanded facilities at this time. So in addition to the use of flow augmentation using surface intakes, the amendment would also allow a potential exception to the standard brine mixing zone, but again, it would only apply to a facility that has received a conditional 13142.5B determination and is over 80% constructed. So to our knowledge, it would be limited to the Carlsbad Desalination Facility. In this case, the discharger must conduct studies to demonstrate that an alternative brine mixing zone, which may not exceed 200 meters from the discharge point, in combination with the flow augmentation system, provides comparable intake and mortality as the preferred technologies. Now, since all other facilities will be using the preferred discharge technologies of either commingling or diffusers, they would be required to have the standard brine mixing zone of no more than 100 meters from each discharge point. And that 100 meters comes from the expert review panel finding for these technologies. The approval of both exceptions will be based on the results of a comparative analysis of the total mortality at the flow augmentation system using surface water intakes with an alternative brine mixing zone and commingling with a standard brine mixing zone if commingling is available, or multi-port diffusers with the standard brine mixing zone if commingling is not available. And we've been told that commingling is not an available brine discharge method for the Carlsbad facility, so that would mean the comparative analysis would be between flow augmentation and diffusers. So this table lists out the factors to be considered when doing the total mortality estimates. Places where you see zeros is where there's expected to be no marine life mortality. Places where there are X's is where there may be some marine life mortality. And these places where there's X's would be where further investigation would be needed to get adequate estimates of mortality associated with that portion of the process. The places where there's 0/X's is where there may be mortality. So this is going to depend on how the facility is designed. So for example, when commingling, if there's adequate wastewater dilution to dilute the brine to at or below natural background salinity, there won't be any osmotic stress or even really a brine mixing zone. However, if there's not adequate wastewater to dilute the brine, there may be some osmotic stress and a brine mixing zone. The comparative analysis would look at the mortality associated with each of these factors and potentially other factors identified by the Regional Water Board and estimate total mortality for each system. In order for the Carlsbad desalination project to be granted the 2 exceptions, the study must show that the mortality associated with the flow augmentation and the larger alternative brine mixing zone results in comparative intake and mortality of all forms of marine life as diffusers and the standard brine mixing zone. And then if these studies that are done at this facility are shown to be as protective as the preferred technologies and others want to start using this, there could be a future amendment to the ocean plan to allow for that. All right, moving on to mitigation. Chapter 3M2E1A of the amendment includes optional additional language for the board members to consider and discuss today. Now, the State Water Board convened expert review panels to identify the best method to assess mitigation associated, to assess entrainment impacts and then determine how much mitigation would be needed. And so the method they suggested to use for this was the empirical transport model coupled with an area production foregone analysis. Now, during our first public comment period, some stakeholders expressed interest in including flexibility for the development of future alternative mitigation assessment methods. Now, at this point in time, there's no specific alternative method being proposed, even though there have been discussions of using the Coastal Ocean Dynamics Applications Radar, or CODAR, to estimate entrainment. Now, this method uses a number of assumptions and is not yet fully developed, but the alternative mitigation language would require a number of steps to ensure that it was scientifically vetted before it was used. Now, if the additional language is included, the additional language would require state and regional water board staff to be able to have the expertise to not only review an ETM APF analysis, but also any other future mitigation model that's proposed for use in the future. There were a few other revisions in the mitigation section after the July 3rd draft. One of the revisions was to allow for out-of-kind mitigation only for soft bottom or open ocean species. And this is because the habitats where these species live are often impractical or infeasible to mitigate, and Water Code Section 13142.5b requires that the mitigation measures be available and feasible. So past projects have allowed for out-of-kind mitigation for soft bottom or open ocean species as long as the mitigation project results in overall better mitigation. So a mitigation ratio could be developed to account for the differences in productivity between the two habitats, but if the impacted habitat is less productive relative to the mitigated habitat, the mitigation ratio can require no less than 1 acre of mitigated habitat for every 10 acres of impacted habitat. And then the regional board also retains the ability to require mitigation ratios for all habitat types to account for the uncertainty associated with the mitigation projects. The amendment also allows for the Regional Water Board to consider previously approved mitigation projects, but they still retain the right to require additional mitigation for conditionally approved or expanded facilities if there's additional intake and mortality of marine life when those facilities either expand or undergo the new conditions. And so the last topic I'm going to cover is natural background salinity and how it relates to the receiving water limitation. The proposed amendment requires that salinity not exceed a daily maximum of 2 parts per thousand or an approved alternative above natural background salinity. Now, we had defined natural background salinity in the July 3rd draft, but we received a number of comments on the definition even as late as this past Monday, May 4th. And so to address those concerns, we revised the amendment to include the following two options for determining natural background salinity. For the first option, an owner or operator would determine the historical monthly average in the proximity of the discharge. And the amendment requires using either 20 years of historical data or data from a 3-year study if historical data are unavailable. The second option is to use the actual salinity at an established reference location or locations. The reference location should be representative of natural background salinity at the proposed discharge location. They should be without apparent human influence. So that means they should be within close proximity to the desal facility, but also sited at a sufficient distance from things like wastewater outfalls or the brine discharge. And there may be a need for multiple reference locations. So for example, one site might serve as a reference for a part of the year, but they may need a secondary site if the first site isn't representative of salinity at the discharge location all year round. And also, if one of the monitoring stations stops producing data for some reason, a second reference location could serve as the backup. So these are things that the Regional Water Board would include clear requirements in a permit to require how the reference locations would be used for determining compliance with the receiving water limitation for salinity or an effluent limitation if one was developed. So to demonstrate compliance with the receiving water limitation for salinity, daily measurements in the receiving water would be required at spots around the brine mixing zone and throughout the water column. And the details of exactly where and how monitoring is conducted would be established in a facilities monitoring and reporting plan. Now, staff assume that rather than doing daily monitoring in the receiving water, that an owner or operator would develop an effluent limitation for salinity using applicable water quality models, and then demonstrate daily compliance with the effluent limitation by measuring salinity at the end of pipe. Now, the Regional Water Board typically requires periodic receiving water monitoring to confirm the effluent limit is adequately protective, and again, these requirements would be in the monitoring and reporting plan. But since natural backgrounds does vary naturally, the Regional Water Board may develop the effluent limitation based on the most conservative scenario, or they could develop multiple effluent limitations that would accommodate for monthly or seasonal variations in salinity. And again, the specifics would be worked out in each individual permit. So the definition of natural background salinity now includes adequate flexibility for seasonal variations in salinity and to provide a discharger with options for demonstrating compliance. Previously, there were concerns that if salinity of the receiving water was naturally high, a discharger would exceed their receiving water limitation if it was relative to the historical average, rather than if it was relative to the actual salinity at a reference location. So in this scenario, it would force a discharger to either have to reduce the volume of brine discharge or the concentration of the brine discharge, which would be achieved either by adding more dilution water, if commingling, or using flow augmentation. So we included the option to use a reference location, but it's not a requirement. And this is because there may be logistical challenges associated with establishing and using a reference location. So the amendment allows for an owner-operator to use reference locations, or they still have the option to use the historical average if they don't want to deploy and maintain continuous salinity monitors around the brine mixing zone and at approved reference locations. So again, these issues will be worked out with the regional water boards in an individual NPDES permit, but we feel that the changes in change sheet 1 and 2 now address this issue that had been consistently raised. And with that, that concludes the staff presentation. So thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead. Sorry, I was just waiting for this to be on. That was beautiful, and I think I want you to do the graphics for all my PowerPoints from now on. So just send me whatever that stuff is. And was that a halibut or a flounder at the bottom of the?
There was California halibut, and I think there was the speckled sand dab. Those are courtesy of Dr. Larry Allen at Cal State Northridge.
Very nice.
Cartoons those.
I was looking at the substance of it as well. I just want to be clear on that, but it's been a long week, so it's nice to see good visuals as well. I'm sorry, Steve.
Well, I'm just so impressed with how 13142.5B rolls off your tongue so effortlessly. And with not
Yeah, but
a
it's nothing
single-
compared to 13247.
Without a single error, so congratulations. On that last point, what we're, with trying to track along with natural background salinity, it's my understanding, part of the reason to be careful about this is we don't want to set up gradients of salinity in the brine discharge zone that are greater than 2 part per thousand, because these gradients set up and stratify and can actually blanket the benthic part of the discharge. It can create hypoxia if it's sustained over time, which would cause mortality. But so in that challenge and with seasonal variation, I wonder if we could try to explain, what are the seasons where that's more of a challenge to, for the operator? Is it the wet season when salinities come down significantly? Because at that point, we're not talking about brine toxicity as much, because there's lower salinities due to stormwater, or runoff from watersheds near shore. Really, the driving force is trying to avoid the stratification and the potential creation of hypoxia. But is that what you found, that in terms of meeting this, not getting greater than 2 parts relative to background, was it the wet season that was the greatest challenge?
So we had heard from dischargers that it was more when natural salinity is high, because that means that their effluent's either going to be naturally higher or, their effluent, the concentration of their brine would be naturally higher, because it's typically twice as salty as the intake water. So when you compare it to, and I think the slide would show this, but it doesn't matter. So when you have your average point, you have points above and below. And so if something's naturally above, it's going to naturally just be above your historical. So that would mean in order to meet the little bit lower number, they'd have to reduce discharge or other things like that. So it would be in a situation when it's prolonged dry weather, potentially. That was when we heard this would be more of a challenge when it's naturally higher. Now, one of the other things that I just think it's important to mention is this is in conjunction with ongoing monitoring. So we do include requirements for hypoxia, benthic, community health, and aquatic toxicity. So it's in conjunction with that to help get at that same issue.
I appreciate the explanation that there is a time of the year where maintaining the 2 parts or meeting the receiving water limitation operationally is more challenging during the dry season and prolonged periods of dry weather. Thank you.
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation, and it captures really well, I think, the hard work that staff has been engaged on with stakeholders on this issue. I just have one follow-up question, and it pertains to the optional additional language on mitigation. I'm a bit uneasy about this proposal to consider alternative mitigation approaches. And part of the uneasiness, and I think this question might be more directed to Chief Deputy Director Bishop, at this point, is it possible to even project the level of staffing resources that might be necessary to engage in review, consultation, and consideration of alternative proposals?
So I can't project the exact staff resources needed, but I can reflect on the what it took to get the initial.
Exactly.
We had
Years of effort.
a panel of experts. We have a couple of our staff working with them continuously. We had to bring them back for additional consultations. So we're not talking about a minor analysis of a calculation. We're talking about a fairly lengthy process of cutting-edge research and analysis. It doesn't mean that it can't be done, but we would expect to impanel another group of experts to review the process and evaluate it. We likely have a multiple stakeholder interactions on it, so that we can evaluate that work and comment on it. There is another option which for the board to consider, which is that instead of allowing it directly in the amendment, in the changes in the amendment, we could indicate in the resolution that that if there was a new approved method, of course the staff can always bring that back for an amendment to the basin plan. We do that all the time. We amend basin plans. We have done 3 amendments, I think, to the once through cooling policy. So we always have that option. If there's a method that comes forward and the proponents convene and help us work through the scientific peer review, at that point we could bring back an amendment as opposed to setting it up right now.
And in that option, how would the resource issue be addressed? Because I assume it would still require staff resources to work on bringing any sort of alternative approach to the board for a future amendment of these amendments.
That's correct. It still would. But as you know, as new information comes forward and new research, we dedicate resources to look at that stuff. It's part of what we do all the time. And this would not preclude, if we didn't include that language, it wouldn't preclude us from coming back and doing an amendment. It just wouldn't automatically allow for us to do it.
Thank you. I just wanted to flag that, and I look forward to hearing comments from the speakers today on either side of this issue. But this is one that that I'm a bit concerned with in terms of a potential addition to these amendments.
Questions over here?
I have a question regarding feasibility and the slide 11. Other factors related to subsurface feasibility addressed by the CEQA lead agency. Could you talk about that? I know we're going to be hearing from folks today that are going to raise concerns about greenhouse gas emissions. So if you could talk about the process to analyze these other factors, and then also in the context of the, I took some notes here but wasn't able to keep up with what you were saying here, looking at a reasonable range of alternatives.
I'll take that one. Phil Wiles, Assistant Chief Counsel for the board. So there are, I think, a couple of issues that are intertwined here in terms of feasibility and alternatives. The first is, as Ms. Wagner explained, we're proposing to eliminate a couple of the factors that are identified in this section because they aren't really, on further reflection, relevant to a comparative analysis for any given site between the feasibility of surface intakes versus subsurface intakes. And that's what this section 3M2D1A is really about. It's how essentially the difference between surface and subsurface intakes should be compared for any given site. So that's the first part, is some of the ones that we're proposing to take out, in our view, generally aren't going to be applicable in every case for that kind of a comparative analysis. There is a provision at the end that says that other factors can be considered. So in the situation where one of those factors really would be relevant for a particular site in determining whether subsurface intakes are feasible compared to surface intakes, there's no reason that the regional board couldn't consider one of the factors that we're proposing to eliminate. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that there are a whole host of more general factors that go into the issues about whether a desalination facility is feasible in one location or another, with one configuration or another, that don't affect intake or mortality of marine life. Some examples are discussed in the staff report, but things like aesthetics, things like conforming land uses in the area of the facility, things that really are very important for to be considered, but aren't directly relevant to minimizing intake and mortality of marine life. Greenhouse gases certainly would be one of those things. Now, we do look at greenhouse gases and energy consumption with respect to the specific provisions in this policy, but we're not attempting to analyze greenhouse gases or energy consumption generally as they apply to the construction of desalination facilities and whether they would be feasible. As Ms. Wagner pointed out, we're not mandating it here in this ocean plan amendment, but those factors absolutely would have to be considered by the CEQA lead agency, be that a water agency or a local agency or the California Coastal Commission, whoever it might be, for any given desalination facility proposal. So they're going to have to look at a wide range of factors about feasibility. And we didn't think it was appropriate with the narrow focus that we have here in terms of interpreting and explaining how to apply Water Code Section 13142.5b.
Oh, show off. You're just trying to show you can say it too.
Was it that transparent? Because you're right.
Other questions? All right, I think we'll just jump right into the public comment, but as you know, we'll be back at you during the public comment as well as later. Let me just say to folks, we'll be doing a series of breaks. I'm going to try and be a little better than I was yesterday. I'm so sorry, Janine. Trying to be a little bit better just so folks can take a breather, walk around, get caffeine, use the facilities, whatever it is, so that we can be clear-eyed and thoughtful as we move through this very important and challenging issue. So we are going to take a short break at 11 o'clock, and then we will go for a later lunch at around 1 o'clock. I'll see where we are in the proceedings, and we may take, again, it won't be an hour, but a half hour just to move with alacrity, but we will probably take some short breaks as we figure out what to do and give staff time to come back with answers to any questions or suggestions that we have after listening to everyone. We do have quite a few speaker cards. A couple of them are in bunches where people wanted to go together, and those are scattered throughout. I'm going to start with elected official representatives, and my apologies if I miss any. I can look back through and see if I have any titles in there, but I know we have Sharon Gonsalves here from Senator Anthony Canella's office, and I'd like to give her the opportunity to go first.
Thank you.
We'll be at 3-minute clock because of how many cards we have.
Okay, great. I have a letter here that we were unable to submit during the written comment portion, so if it's okay, I'd just read that today. Okay. Again, my name's Sharon Gonsalves. I'm the Legislative Director for Senator Anthony Canella. Chairwoman Marcus and fellow members of the board, I am writing today in support of the desalination amendment to the Ocean Plan. The amendment is intended to provide consistency to the permitting process throughout the state and provide guidance for regional boards evaluating new and expanded facilities. This amendment also takes into consideration benefits of desalination, weighing them against the potential harm to marine life, as there is the risk that some species would be harmed in the construction process of surface and subsurface water intakes. California is in the midst of a devastating drought, and the state should be doing everything it can to ensure that desal projects can get off the ground quickly and efficiently so that Californians can access a reliable source of water. Monterey County, and particularly the Salinas Valley, have spent several decades struggling with seawater intrusion and groundwater contamination. In addition, they do not receive any water from the state water project. The California Water Service Company, which services the city of Salinas, filed a petition with the Public Utilities Commission that would impose mandatory water conservation, which includes odd even watering days as well as evening and early morning watering only. Now is not the time to handicap the ability to have access to desalination for Salinas or any community on the Monterey Bay. We are in critical times with the impacts of the drought. Your consideration of this amendment will help Californians and my constituents keep options open for reasonable solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nicely said. Appreciate it. Jason Burnett for the Monterey Peninsula Regional Water Authority, where he's the president, but also mayor of Carmel.
Good morning, Chair, board members, staff, and public. My name is Jason Burnett, and I am the mayor of Carmel. I'm also the president of the Monterey Peninsula Regional Water Authority, representing the 6 cities of the Monterey Peninsula. Let me start by saying that desalination is no panacea. It is expensive to build and to operate. If not done right, water intake and brine discharge harm marine life, and energy demands increase greenhouse gas emissions. Desal is also not practical for addressing short-term drought because it takes years to plan, permit, and build. So why have we concluded that desalination must be part of our water supply portfolio? When, why, and how might it be appropriate for others? First, invest in conservation. Doing otherwise wastes the public's money and risks repeating the mistake of the mothballed plants in Australia. We use 55 gallons per person per day in our area. Second, align the time frame of the solution with the time frame of the problem. As you know all too well, we have a long-standing and long-term need to cease and desist the illegal pumping from the Carmel River. Third, do a comprehensive review of water supply options and alternatives. For example, water recycling is often cheaper and better than desalination. We are reducing the size of the desalination plant by about 1/3 by including water recycling. We also did an apples-to-apples review of multiple desalination proposals and alternatives. Fourth, pursue subsurface intake in earnest. A key policy question for you is whether you create the dynamic whereby desalination developers work to prove desalination intake is feasible or work to prove it is not feasible. We on the Monterey Peninsula will succeed with subsurface intake precisely because we refuse to take no for an answer. Farmers are concerned about the impact of their aquifer, and we reached a settlement agreement with them and others. Multiple permitting agencies have different ideas of where to locate the wells. We sat down with all of them and settled on a disturbed area in an active sand mine. The landowner, Cemex, was not fully cooperative, but we resolved our differences. Permitting of the test well was studied by the city of Marina for about a year, and they concluded more review was necessary. We appealed to the Coastal Commission, and they granted a permit. That permit was challenged in the courts, including attempts to block construction and operation. We, or actually the Coastal Commission and the Attorney General, have won on all counts. Each of these obstacles could have been used to show subsurface intake is not feasible. Instead, we persevered and overcame each obstacle. We now have an operational test slant well pumping more than enough water. Salinity is looking better each day, and we are on track to show that subsurface intake for our case is feasible. In doing so, we hope to solve our longstanding water supply challenge in an economically and environmentally responsible manner. We hope our experience is helpful to you and others in the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all your hard work and looking at the totality of the issues that face the peninsula. Your leadership is extraordinarily helpful. Next, we have Peter McLagan from Poseidon Water. Oh, followed by, sorry. Thank you. That's why you have a vice chair. Joe Gunter, I believe it says, from the city of Salinas. Mayor Gunter. Do you want to go first, or do you want to? You let him go first, sorry. See, I didn't see the mayor part. I should have looked at it. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going through and looking for all these mayors.
Well, I don't know how many mayors there are here today, but thank you for allowing me to talk. I'm Joe Gunter. I'm the mayor of Salinas, the largest city in Monterey County. Salinas is threatened by saltwater intrusion, creating a significant impact on potable water. I was happy to see the mayor of Carmel here. We were part of the solution in providing them with water. We have taken the lead on ag wash water, where we ship 4 million gallons a day into the aquifer to hold back saltwater intrusion. We're going to be giving 1 million gallons a day to the peninsula to help them until they can get their desal plant underway. The current drought experience is an important reminder for the need of flexibility when developing public policy. The explicit subsurface intake requirement does not meet the critically important public policy needed to have all the options available to water resources. And adopting water resource infrastructure is global. Climate change and the product zone in the deep Monterey Bay subcanyon is where we would be going. It would to minimize what happens with the species in the ocean. We are highly concerned, as everybody else is, about what happens and how we protect our environment. Desalination water will be a replacement water, which will help meet our critical need to maintain a reliable water source and supply for our residents. Please do not adopt an ocean policy that impairs our citizens' ability to have an existing water supply. We ask that you think about what policies you develop and the importance of amending some of the language so that our deepwater desal will have an opportunity to provide water for the residents of the Salinas Valley. It is not just for the 160,000 people in Salinas Valley. This will help maintain the $4 billion agriculture industry and the water that we currently have for that has to feed the world. So we need your help, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor. And I know there are a lot of speakers who will be speaking about that project later in the queue.